A German Shepherd pup wasn't just lost in the storm. He was found at its very core, locked inside a rusted cage in a desolate barn, his cries battling the wind. Just one photo, one message was enough to pull a retired Navy SEAL from his quiet exile. He drove straight into the heart of the blizzard, broke the lock, and carried the trembling pup home. Neither knew that single night would irrevocably alter their destinies. In the months that followed, they came to understand that healing isn't forged by medals or missions. It comes through silence in trust, and with a heartbeat that answers your own. And deep within that stillness, perhaps that's where God keeps his smallest miracles. Before the story unfolds, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story resonates with you, we invite you to subscribe for more. Snow fell in heavy, fractured sheets across the silent streets of Denver, blanketing the rooftops in a cold porcelain light. The wind crept through the alleys like a mournful whisper, too weary to howl. Jake Miller navigated through it, his wipers dragging a smear of frost across the frozen glass, his old Ford groaning like a restless spirit. The heater was failing his own breath, clouding the glass in soft, rhythmic pulses. Jake was 34, tall and broad-shouldered, carrying himself with a posture that still echoed with discipline. His hair, short and dark, was cut from habit, not style, and his jaw held the faint shadow of a beard that spoke not of rebellion, but of weariness. His eyes, a flat gray, like smoke after the gunfire, were calm, yet frayed around the edges, like a man who had been trained to hear the threat concealed in silence. His hands, calloused and powerful, clutched the steering wheel as though it were his only anchor to the present moment. Beside him, the text from Ruth Collins illuminated the phone's cracked screen. Ruth, an animal rescue worker whose bravery was rumored to outweigh her common sense, had been his neighbor before he retreated to the quiet fringes on Denver's northern edge. She was in her early 40s, compact and strong, with vibrant copper hair typically hidden under a wool beanie, her skin dusted with mountain sun freckles. Ruth spoke quickly, drove even quicker, and lived by the code that kindness was an action, not a word. She'd been with the rescue center for 15 years, mending strays, saving hawks from barbed wire, and bringing raccoons back from the edge. Her message had been brutally simple. Shepherd pup abandoned. North warehouse off 47th. Won't last the night. Attached was a single stark photo, a tiny form huddled behind corroded wire, its eyes wide but vacant. Jake had no intention of going. Not really. He had sworn he was done with rescues, finished with charging toward a pain he could not possibly fix. But as the storm coiled itself tighter around the city, something primal stirred deep inside him. The very instinct that once propelled him through walls of fire and cacophony. In the pup's vacant stare, he saw the final moment he shared with Corporal Dean Maddox, his teammate, his brother, who had bled out on foreign sand, whispering words Jake would never hear. Lost forever to the thunder of an explosion. For years, that deafening silence had stalked him like a shadow. Now gazing at the photo, that silence took on a new form, small, shivering and trapped behind a locked gate. His truck groaned as it turned off the main road, its tires grinding over the frozen ground. The GPS sputtered, dissolving into static. Jake relied on memory instead. Old recon maps were still seared into his mind. The warehouse wasn't far, perhaps 15 minutes north of the old rail yard. The glow of the city vanished behind him, swallowed by an endless, unforgiving white. Fences sagged half-buried under heavy drifts of snow. Skeletal frames of unfinished houses clawed at the gray sky. A mournful wind shrieked through their naked steel beams and silent, forgotten signs. His high beam snared a lone deer as it bolted across the road, a fleeting specter of pale gold before the storm reclaimed it. He envied its purpose, its instinct for where to go. The warehouse, when he finally found it, was a collapsing wreck, its corrugated metal walls buckling inward. One of the massive bay doors hung broken from its hinges. Jake killed the engine and sat in the sudden, deafening quiet, listening to the storm tear at the truck. He could have just stayed there, let the snow erase every trace of him, but the searing image of that photo wouldn't let him. The small cage, the frost clinging to fragile fur, that vision pushed him out into the brutal cold. The air instantly bit at his face. It stung its way through his beard. He cinched his parka tighter, his breath a heavy white cloud. Snow groaned under his boots as he circled the ruin. Then he heard it. A sound so thin it was almost lost to the wind. A broken, pathetic whimper. He froze in place. It came again, sharper this time from the wreckage of a collapsed wall. Jake dropped to his knees, clawing away snow, until a chain-link cage emerged. Inside was a puppy no more than 12 weeks old. Its coat, a patchy mix of tan and black, was matted thick with ice. Every rib showed a pale ladder against its skin in the gloom. Its eyes were immense in its starved face, one ear standing guard, the other drooping a picture of lopsided, battered innocence. The puppy didn't bark. It simply stared quiet and utterly resigned. Jake crouched down, his voice dropping to the low, steady register he reserved for a wounded comrade in the field. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, his tone a calm anchor in the gale. "You all alone out here?" The dog didn't so much as twitch. He reached forward, his fingers brushing the padlock. It was rusted solid. He pulled a multi-tool from his pocket, twisting until metal screamed against metal. The piercing noise felt like a violation in the solemn quiet. Finally, with a sharp crack, the lock gave way. The gate creaked open an inch, then two. Jake waited. The pup didn't flee. It just watched him, a violent tremble running through its tiny frame. He extended a gloved hand, palm up. "It's all right," he whispered. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. The little dog's nose twitched, catching the scent of wool and cold and man. Then, painstakingly, it inched forward. One shaky step, then another. When its paw brushed his sleeve, he felt the faintest tremor through the heavy fabric, the pulse of a life that was still fighting. He slipped off his glove and touched the pup's fur. It was wet and ice-cold, yet softer than he could have imagined. "You're a tough one, aren't you?" he said, his voice thick. The dog didn't flinch as he carefully wrapped it in his parka. It just went limp, eyes half closed, surrendering to a kindness it had given up on. Carrying it back to the truck, Jake could feel its thready heartbeat against his own chest, faint and fast. But it was there. It was steady. He set the precious bundle on the passenger seat, blasted the heater to its max, and watched condensation fog the glass, sealing them in their own world. "You're gonna need a name," he said to the silence. Outside, the snow was a blinding swirl of silver and white, erasing everything. The road sign ahead was barely visible through the flurries. Rex Street. A faint, tired smile touched Jake's lips, a weary curve that didn't reach his eyes. "Rex," he said softly. "That'll do?" The drive back was a slow crawl, each mile a test of will. The storm hammered the windshield. The wipers groaned under the strain, but inside the cab, a small, fragile warmth between them began to grow. Every so often, Rex would stir inside the coat, pressing closer to Jake's arm, as if learning the very rhythm of his breathing. It wasn't until the city lights bled back into view that Jake felt the tension finally drain from his shoulders. He pulled up to his apartment, a modest space tucked away on the top floor of an old converted firehouse. Red brick walls stood under a single flickering porch light. Inside, the room was Spartan but clean. A meticulously folded blanket lay on the couch beside a steel coffee table. A photo frame was turned face down. He gently set Rex on a towel beside the radiator and knelt down beside him. The little pup's eyes fluttered open, blinking against the unfamiliar light, a mix of confusion and curiosity shining in their depths. Jake poured some water into a bowl, placed it close, and leaned back against the wall. For the first time in ages, the silence in the room felt alive. He simply watched the puppy breathe, each rise and fall of its chest a small defiance to the storm outside. His thoughts drifted to Maddox, the desert, and the internal noise he could never escape. Maybe he realized this little life was a second chance, a way to finish a rescue that had been left undone. Outside, the wind began to subside. The snow continued its descent, but softer now, as if the storm itself had found a reason to be still. Jake rested his head against the wall, his eyes closing. "Welcome home, soldier," he whispered into the quiet. The dawn over Sloan's Lake was a pale wash of light, offering no warmth, only a stark clarity. A delicate layer of frost traced patterns on the window of Jake Miller's small apartment as the low hum of the heater inhabited the silence. The air carried the faint scent of damp wool and old coffee. Jake was on the floor next to the radiator, his legs extended before him, a half-empty mug balanced on his knee. Opposite him, on a folded blanket, Rex was curled into a tight, protected ball, one paw twitching in a dream, the other tucked under his chin. His coat was cleaner now, but still coarse and ragged from the bitter cold. And his breathing was a soft, deliberate rhythm, like someone counting the moments between each heartbeat. For a long time, Jake just watched him, his gaze unwavering and lost in thought. He had spent years in deserts where silence was a predator and movement was survival. Here now, silence held a different kind of weight. He could make out the faint tick of the heater, the steady cadence of Rex's breath, the far-off scrape of a snow shovel down the hill. Each sound on this quiet morning was proof that he was still here, that he could still notice the little things that mattered. He raised his coffee, took a sip, and said in a low voice, "You breathe like a soldier, kid. Slow, steady. Controlled." Rex's ear flickered in response, but his sleep held. A faint smile touched Jake's lips, an expression still hesitant, as if he were rediscovering the very muscles that made it possible. He'd been stateside now for 18 long months, and yet home still felt like foreign ground beneath his feet. For him, the war had ended on a dusty street somewhere near Fallujah, but its echoes still ricocheted through every quiet moment. He'd tried it all, the therapy, the constant noise, the distance, but nothing silenced the static. Not until last night, when a cold, terrified creature finally fell asleep beside him. For the very first time, the silence didn't ache. By mid-morning, the sun had finally won, turning the window's frost into slow, deliberate tears. Jake laced up his boots, grabbed his jacket, and knelt by the heater. "All right, you and me, we're taking a little field trip." "Rex," he said softly. "Time for the vet." The name still felt foreign on his tongue, but the little dog seemed to know it was his. Rex's head rose at the sound, his eyes blinking as he pushed himself unsteadily up. His legs were skeletal, yet refused to buckle. When Jake offered his hand, the pup sniffed at a fragile exhale, escaping him a sound caught between a flicker of trust and deep-seated fear. The veterinary clinic stood 2 blocks from the lake, wedged between a warm bakery and a quiet locksmith. Fresh bread and sterile antiseptic mingled in the air as Jake pushed through the glass door, holding Rex close to his chest. The interior was warm, with cream-colored walls and quiet classical music. Behind the counter, Dr. Sarah Collins glanced up from a clipboard, a woman in her late 30s, tall and slender, carrying a certain graceful weariness. A loose blonde braid fell over her shoulder, just brushing the collar of her deep green sweater, and delicate lines framed her hazel eyes, not from age, but from years of silent empathy for those who couldn't speak. "Morning," she said, her voice a low, steady, and practiced calm. "What do we have here?" Jake placed Rex gently on the counter. "German Shepherd pup. Found him last night in a north side yard. Locked in a cage, malnourished, no water." Sarah leaned in her gaze, penetrating yet soft. Her fingers hovered just over the puppy's spine, never making contact, as if sensing his pain from the air itself. "He's lucky you were there," she said. 12 weeks old, perhaps 13. Frostbite on his paws is just starting its minor." She knelt to meet Rex's gaze. "Hey, tough guy, you did your part. We'll take it from here." Her tone held that rare warmth animals instantly trust. Rex didn't flinch. His eyes just locked on hers, his pupils wide, his breath coming in short, rapid bursts. Sarah nodded. "No aggression? Good." She slowly stood, glancing over at Jake. "Military." He hesitated. "Was?" "I thought so." she said, gesturing to the tattoo just visible on his wrist. Coordinates inked in black. You stand like someone waiting for orders. He smirked slightly. Habits die hard. She returned the smile. Some habits are what keep us alive. While Sarah examined Rex, Jake saw the slight tremor in her left hand. It was almost invisible if you weren't looking for it. Perhaps fatigue, perhaps something more, yet her touch remained impeccably precise and tender. Her voice dropped even softer now. He's got old rope marks on his neck. Was probably tied up for a long time, but his heart is strong. Jake's jaw went rigid. Whoever did this shouldn't be allowed near animals. Banana, people like that shouldn't be allowed near anything, she answered, her tone factual, drained of bitterness. She moved towards the sink and began washing her hands. Are you planning to keep him? Jake's eyes fell upon the pup, now cautiously sniffing the counter's edge. One ear still flopped over, tail tucked low, but the trembling had stopped. Yeah, Jake said softly. Looks like he's got nobody else. Sarah dried her hands, passing him a form. Then he is yours. Just feed him small meals every few hours. Keep him warm and don't push for contact. The trauma's made him wary. Let him come to you. Jake nodded. Understood. You catch on fast, she noted with another smile. Comes with the training, I imagine. Something like that. As she completed the checkup, Sarah's eyes flicked to the door as an older man stepped inside, dusting snow from his heavy coat. Tom, could you grab me a towel? She called out. Tom Weaver, her assistant, was in his 50s, stocky with a permanent 5, a clock shadow, and a voice weathered by years spent working outdoors. He was a firefighter once before a bad injury took his left knee out of the fight. Now he'd traded the scent of smoke for sawdust and emergency calls for rescued animals. You got it, Doc, he said, tossing her a towel with a practiced grin. Who's our newest recruit? Jake nodded his thanks. Tom sized him up for a moment. Marine, he guessed. Navy SEAL, Jake corrected, and Tom's grin grew wider. Ah, one of the quiet professionals. Makes sense. Sarah rolled her eyes. Don't mind him. He loves collecting stories that aren't his. Occupational hazard, Tom chuckled, limping toward the back. By the time they'd finished, Sarah had already assembled a small care package medicine, vitamins, and a guide on helping traumatized puppies recover. She placed the bag in Jake's hand. You'll be great. Just remember, before he can be trained, he has to feel safe. Jake took the bag. I'll try. Trying is where it begins, she said, then added softly, for both of you. Outside, the air held a hint of warmth. The storm was over, leaving behind puddles of slushy snow that mirrored the overcast sky. Jake set Rex down on the wet sidewalk. The pup sniffed the concrete, pawed curiously at a murky puddle, and then sneezed. A quiet laugh escaped Jake. It was the first real one in months, and the sound of it so natural almost shocked him. All right, little soldier, he murmured. Time to go home. Back in their apartment, the day moved in quiet, measured steps. Jake boiled some chicken, shredded it into tiny pieces, and placed it on a plate next to a bowl of water. Rex crept forward, sniffed the food, then glanced up, his eyes asking for permission. It's all yours, Jake said softly. The pup began to eat cautiously at first, then more quickly. His tail twitched once, a tiny heartbeat, finding its rhythm again. Jake leaned against the counter, just watching. There was something sacred in that simple act of eating. A quiet insistence on living. As evening fell, the heater hummed a steady, low tune, its orange light dancing on the walls. Jake sat on the floor cross-legged. Rex was sprawled out on the floor nearby. He drew a deep breath, held it, and let it out slow. All right, buddy, he whispered. Lesson 1, breathing. He took another breath, deep and even. Inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth. Calm, stay calm. The pup watched him, tilting its head. After a few moments, Rex echoed the rhythm in his own canine way. A bit faster, shorter, but still steady. Jake chuckled softly. Good boy. You're already better at this than most of the men I served with. He sat that way until the city faded into twilight, until the sounds of the city grew soft and distant. For the very first time since he'd returned, Jake no longer felt like a man just waiting for his life to begin again. He was living at one slow, quiet breath at a time. The following days moved with the patience of a slow thaw. Each morning, light over Sloan's Lake pushed weakly through the frost-covered window, filling Jake Miller's small apartment with the quiet rhythm of a life finding its warmth again. He never thought a routine could be a cure, and yet within the clumsy rituals of care, something deep inside him began to thaw. His once sterile and quiet kitchen now held the faint scent of chicken broth and cooked oatmeal. Jake stood over the counter sleeves, pushed up his arms, stirring a bowl with more focus than he'd ever paid to a field manual. His hands, built for precision and sheer force, now seemed clumsy at the soft work of mixing food for a creature barely heavier than his old rucksack. Nearby, Rex sat on the mat, his head tilted, his eyes following every single motion. His ears, almost even now, stood at attention, listening, as if he too was trying to decipher the rhythm of this fragile new life. Sarah Collins, the vet, had given him the directive small meals served every few hours. A new, fragile mission. She'd scripted it in clean, precise letters on a receipt with one line he couldn't shake loose: "Love is a steady routine." She had also passed him the leather collar, dark brown, unadorned, and built to endure. Its single steel buckle was polished to a low gleam. "When he's ready," she'd said. Jake set it on the shelf beside the framed photograph he still couldn't bring himself to face. The collar lay there next to it, a silent vigil. Two silent relics waiting for the order to join the living. That morning as Jake stirred the food, he spoke to the ghosts in the room. "You'd get a hell of a kick out of this, Maddox." He muttered the words just for him. "A seal cooking mush." The silence answered, broken only by Rex's quiet huff. A sound that felt suspiciously like a private joke. A ghost of a smirk touched Jake's lips. "Yeah, you think it's funny too." The humor was a fragile, hesitant thing, lingering like the last trace of warmth from a fire long since burned out. When Rex finished, he meticulously cleaned his muzzle, then fixed his eyes on Jake with a silent, hopeful expectancy. "What's next?" Jake asked the question as much for himself. The dog blinked, then padded silently toward the door. Outside, the daylight was thin and gray, like shattered glass. Old snow clung to the curbs in frozen, dirty ridges. Jake zipped his jacket against the chill and unlatched the door. He let the dog step onto the narrow balcony. The pup tested the frigid air, his ears flickering at the far-off blare of a car horn. The wind rattled the metal railing. For a long moment, the world seemed vast and overwhelming, but he stood his ground. He didn't retreat. Jake watched from the doorway, giving him space. He knew exactly what it was like to face a new world after being locked away in the dark for too long. Later that afternoon, the shrill buzz of the doorbell cut through the quiet, a sound that almost never breached those walls. He froze his body, tensing before he finally moved to the door. On the other side stood Lydia Grant, the building's superintendent. She was a woman in her late 50s, her frame forged by years of hard work and harder winters. A red bandana held back her steel-gray hair, and her cheeks held the high color of a life spent wrestling with bitter winds and busted pipes. "Morning, Jake," she said, her voice all business as she held up a clipboard. "Just checking smoke alarms. City's coming through next week." He simply nodded, stepping back. "Sure, come on in." As she passed, her sharp gaze fell upon the small, still shape of the dog by the radiator. "Well, I'll be—" She breathed, her entire demeanor instantly softening. "Would you look at that? You went and got a dog." "Sort of," Jake answered quietly. "Rescue, I figured." Lydia nodded, lowering herself with an unexpected grace. She offered the back of her hand. Rex sniffed it with grave caution, then offered a single tentative lick. "Oh, he's a gentleman. You don't see that much. My brother, he used to train shepherds for the state troopers. Stubborn as all get out, every last one, but loyal as the dawn once you earn it." A flicker of a smile touched Jake's mouth. "We're working on the trust part. Her eyes lifted to his, seeing past the calm exterior to the bone-deep exhaustion within. "You know," she said gently, "dogs are quicker to remember kindness than people are. Just keep at it." Then, with a knowing wink that held more warmth than a furnace, she rose and finished her inspection. After she left, the small apartment seemed less shadowed somehow. That evening, Jake settled onto the couch, notebook clutched in his hand. A small, worn leather book, the kind a soldier carried for battlefield notes. But now, instead of grids and ammo counts, he was logging something else entirely. Day 5, eating more, eyes tracking everything. Still jumps at sudden sounds, but comes back quicker. And below that, humor returning slowly. Maybe that's the sound of healing. He shut the book a long breath, leaving his chest, and looked to Rex, dozing by the heater's glow. The dog's paws trembled, chasing ghosts in his sleep. Jake wondered what ghosts he was chasing. Open fields, he hoped, or a silence that didn't ache. A sharp rap on the door ripped through the quiet, jolting them both. Jake was on his feet, instincts screaming even here. He opened it to find Ruth Collins brushing a dusting of snow from her scarf. The wind had painted her cheeks a raw, biting red, but her eyes held a fire that exhaustion couldn't touch. "Don't look so shocked," she said. "I keep tabs on my rescues." Jake moved aside, letting the cold air follow her in. "You came through this for that." She just smiled. "Seen worse. Besides, I brought a peace offering." From her bag, she produced a small paper box. The scent hit him immediately. Freshly baked pastries, warm and buttery. "Apple turnovers. The bakery on 14th still owes me." Rex moved in low, cautiously sniffing at her snow-dusted boots. Ruth knelt, her movements slow measured. "Hey there, soldier," she whispered. "You remember me?" The dog's ears pricked a flicker of recognition, his nose twitching, and then a barely there huff of air softer than a breath. Ruth's smile bloomed. "Progress." Jake watched from the counter, arms folded. "He's eating. Still so quiet, though." "Quiet isn't a bad thing," she replied, rising to her feet. "Sometimes quiet means they're observing learning. You of all people should know that." He gave a slow nod. "Fair point." They sat at the small table sharing the coffee and pastries, while Rex settled on the floor between them, chin on his paws. Ruth's eyes swept the small apartment. "You're making this a home," she observed. "Didn't figure you'd plant roots this long." Jake just shrugged. "Never had a reason to." Ruth studied his face for a moment, her voice softening. "Found one now, have you?" Her gaze drifted to the dog. "Maybe he's reason enough." Long after she was gone, Jake remained at the window, watching the snow swirl in the lonely cone of a streetlight. The city was a whisper, cloaked in gray. He turned and saw Rex sitting before the shelf, staring up at the heavy brown leather collar. The dog tilted his head, then his eyes found Jake's, an unspoken question hanging in the air between them. Jake knelt beside him, his hand closing over the collar. The leather was still warm from the heater, smooth beneath his thumb. "Not yet, buddy," he said softly. "You'll let me know when it's time." Rex blinked, then leaned in, resting his chin for a heartbeat against Jake's knee. The gesture was fleeting, but it was heavy with meaning. The very first anchor of trust in all that quiet. Later, when the heater clicked off, the apartment fell into a deep and settled hush. Jake was on the floor by the couch, Rex curled nearby, the collar on the table like a silent promise. He found his voice again, the words low and steady. "You know," he murmured, "back in the teams we had a saying, slow is smooth. And smooth is fast. Maybe that's how this works too. This healing." The dog let out a long, taatu breath, and a real smile touched Jake's face. Outside, the snow was falling again, not a storm this time, but like a soft memory blanketing the world. He reached over, tucking the blanket around the sleeping dog. "Sleep easy, Rex," he whispered. "We got all the time we need." and for the first time, time felt like an ally. The storm ambushed the quiet rhythm of the Denver evening. Clouds over the Front Range bruised, turning a swollen, menacing black, crushing the skyline like a slowly clenching fist. Inside, Jake Miller just sat staring out the window, a forgotten mug of coffee growing cold in his grip as Rex slept soundly by the radiator. A heavy metallic taste filled the air, the kind of air that smelled like old memories. The first crack of thunder ripped through the quiet, a sharp, violent tear. Rex jolted awake, his ears rigid, his eyes blown wide. A second clap, closer this time, rattled the window pane. A low, uncertain whimper escaped the dog as he scrambled for cover beneath the table. Instantly, Jake's muscles seized his chest, constricted, and his breath caught high in his throat. That sound wasn't just thunder. It was the ghost of detonation, the phantom echo of incoming rounds. For a single, terrifying heartbeat, he was back in that desert hell, the air choked with sand and fear, the very ground shaking under his feet. The coffee mug slipped from his hand. It shattered on impact, the dark liquid spreading across the floorboards like a fresh wound. He froze, his fists clenching into stones, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. And then cutting through the fog of memory, he saw the small, trembling body huddled under the table. Jake lowered himself to the floor, each movement careful, deliberate, his every breath a measured count. "Easy, boy," he whispered, his voice the low, steady baritone he'd been trained to use in a crisis. "It's just noise. Nothing's coming for us." But Rex remained frozen, his eyes darting to Jake, and then back to the window. A flash of lightning bleached the room white for a stark, silent instant, illuminating the scars that mapped his forearm like ancient, dried-up rivers. He didn't reach for the dog. He just held his ground, anchoring himself in the simple presence of another terrified soul. Outside, the rain began an unsteady tapping against the window pane. Jake began to match his breathing to its rhythm, slow and patient. In through the nose, out through the mouth. 1 beat, 2, 3. The thunder's roar softened to a distant rumble. The dog's tremors began to subside, the panic receding like a slow tide. After what felt like an eternity, Jake whispered, "You're doing good, Rex. Real good." The pup slowly lifted his head, his ears still half-pinned in fear. Another faint rumble echoed across the sky, but this time Rex held steady. He didn't flinch. He tested the air with a sniff, then crept forward until his wet nose brushed against Jake's wrist. The contact was feather light, yet it sent a jolt through him. It rested right on the pale, jagged scar that traced the inside of his arm. A ghost from shrapnel years ago. The same wound that ached whenever a storm rolled in. The dog's warm nose lingered there, a small point of heat against his cold skin. Jake let out a breath. He didn't realize he was holding a shaky, almost silent laugh. You always know right where it hurts, don't you, pal?" The rain was coming down in sheets now, a steady drumming against the roof. Jake stayed there, his back against the wall, until his breathing and Rex's finally found the same steady rhythm. Two survivors measuring out the calm in each other's breath. It wasn't a command, and it wasn't just comfort. It was presence. The same silent strength he'd offered his men when the line was about to break. "Don't run," he used to say. "Just hold." When the storm finally eased to a steady downpour, Jake pushed himself up to clean the shattered mug. He flicked on the old radio on the counter, twisting the dial through a sea of static, until a soft jazz station finally broke through. The warm, forgiving notes of a lone trumpet filled the small apartment. Rex slid out from under the table, cautious, his tail low, but giving a single hopeful wag. A faint smile touched Jake's lips. "Music helps, doesn't it?" The dog tilted his head, circled twice, and then settled down right beside Jake's worn-out boots. Much later that night, Jake switched on the small electric fireplace in the corner, its artificial flames casting a soft, humming glow across the room. The firelight cast a fragile peace across the room, a warmth that felt real, if only for a moment. He sat folded on the floor, a notebook open in his lap, scrawling a single heavy truth. Fear doesn't leave. It just learns your name. His gaze then shifted to the dog, drawn to the flickering warmth, his coat glowing like burnished bronze in the firelight. When morning came, it brought the clean scent of rain-soaked concrete and pine. The storm had broken, leaving behind puddles that held the fractured gray sky in their reflection. For the first time, Jake fashioned a leash from an old leather belt, a makeshift tether. "We're testing boundaries today," he murmured. Rex yielded, following without protest, a quiet curiosity in his cautious steps. Their path led them down toward Sloane's Lake, the trees still weeping from the night's relentless rain. The only sounds were the steady crunch of gravel under boot and paw, a rhythm in the quiet. A lone jogger approached, a woman in her late 20s, auburn hair tied back, lost in her music. She offered a brief smile and a wave. "Cute dog?" Her voice carried on the damp air. Jake gave a curt nod, his focus entirely on Rex, tracking her departure with that same guarded interest. "She's right, you know," he breathed. "You're just trouble wrapped in fur." The pup's tail gave a single, knowing flick. They reached the edge of the lake, and Jake stopped. The water was a sheet of mercury under a pale sun, the distant mountains still crowned with snow. He knelt beside Rex, his fingers unclipping the old belt. "Go on," he urged softly. The pup tested the air, then took a hesitant step, placing a paw in the shallows. A perfect ripple spread out, fracturing the light, and for the very first time, Rex barked. A single, sharp, startled sound that shattered the stillness. A raw, surprised laugh escaped Jake's lips. "Well, that's new." The dog tried again, a bit louder this time, then looked straight up at Jake, his eyes searching for approval. Jake offered it freely, with a wide, cracking grin. "Yeah, that's your voice, soldier. Took you long enough to find it." They remained by the water until the sky began to seal itself over again. On the walk home, Jake's hand found the brown collar still tucked in his pocket. He worked the smooth leather between his fingers. "Maybe soon," he whispered to the air. As if hearing the thought, Rex gently nudged his leg. Back inside, an envelope had been slipped beneath his door. He recognized the neat, steady handwriting immediately. It was from Sarah. Inside, a simple card held just 6 words. "Storm's Test Trust. You both passed." Tucked beside it was a tiny charm, a perfect compass, no larger than a dime. He turned it over in his palm, the metal cool and heavy against his skin, etched with 4 letters NSEW. A silent gift, a way forward. He carefully attached it to the brown collar, laying them both on the table. "When he's ready," he promised himself. That night, Jake's dreams weren't of the desert, but of a gentle rain slowly turning to snow, blanketing a wide-open field where a small dog ran without a leash, without fear. In the dream, the air was clean, smelling of cedar and salt, and the sky held no thunder, only the rhythm of a steady breath. He woke in the pre-dawn quiet to find Rex asleep beside the couch, pressed tight against him, one paw resting protectively on his boot. The first hint of light etched their shadows on the wall, one broken, one small, both perfectly still. Jake reached down his fingers, gently tracing the soft fur behind the pup's ear. "You did good last night," he whispered. "We did all right." Beyond their window, the world was stirring, waking to a fragile sun. The city would soon find its roar, cars, voices, traffic. But in here, in this small apartment, there was only the quiet rhythm of a heartbeat. On the morning after the first bark, Denver felt different, softer, as if the whole city had held its breath to listen. The last of the snow had begun its retreat, melting into a shimmering film that caught the dawn like fractured glass. Jake Miller slid the window open, letting crisp air sweep the apartment. It carried the ghost of pine and wood smoke, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he didn't recoil from the sudden sounds outside. Rex held a proud vigil by the door, his tail a steady, quiet rhythm against the worn floor. His chest puffed out, just so proud of discovering his own voice. That single bark had shifted something deep and intangible. It was no longer a sound of fear, but one of presence, a quiet declaration that they both existed in this world together. From the kitchen, Jake brewed coffee and watched the dog. He'd hung the worn leather collar by the window, letting sunlight catch its steel buckle. The small compass charm glinted softly, turning with each gust of wind. He smiled, recalling Sarah's note storm's test trust. She had been right. The worst storms don't always come from the sky. They are born from silence. And this morning, that silence was no longer an enemy. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his reverie. As he opened it, a warm cloud of cinnamon and maple filled the hall. It was Mrs. Eleanor Baker, the woman from the apartment downstairs, holding a tray hidden by a red checkered towel. She was in her early 70s, short and a little stooped, with silver hair pinned neatly, and bright blue eyes that still held a spark of mischief. Her sweater was thick and cheery, dotted with small snowflake patterns. "Morning, soldier," she said, her grin wide. "Heard your partner down there finally found his voice." She nodded toward Rex, who peeked from behind Jake's leg. "Now that is worth celebrating." An awkward smile touched Jake's lips. "You didn't have to." "Nonsense," she cut in, pushing the warm tray into his hands. "Fresh waffles for you. I always make too much anyway. Just consider it a tax for living above an old woman who loves good stories." She bent down, wagging a finger playfully at Rex. "And what about you, mister, planning to serenade the neighborhood again?" Rex let out a low, rumbling woof, his tail sweeping across the floor. Mrs. Baker chuckled. "Polite and handsome. You've trained him well." "Not much training to speak of," Jake admitted. "He's teaching me more than I am him." Mrs. Baker gave a knowing nod. "That's how the good ones are people, or dogs. They don't fix you, they make you want to fix yourself." She then straightened up, dusted her hands, then added, "My sewing circle meets later. If you ever need a hand patching up those service jeans, just bring them by. Don't let pride ruin a good pair of pants." A genuine laugh escaped him. "Deal!" As she walked away, Rex let out a quiet yip as if saying goodbye. By midday, a new kind of energy was humming through the building's halls. The kids from 2 floors down, a trio of them, bundled in puffy jackets and snow boots, knocked on Jake's front door. Faces flushed from the cold. The oldest, Tommy Rivera, maybe 9 or 10 years old, had freckles dotting his nose, and the easy confidence that came from being the natural ringleader of the group. "Mr. Jake," he said out of breath. "Can we pet your dog? We heard he can talk." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Talks, yeah." Tommy grinned. "Mrs. Baker said he's real polite and says hello." Rex tilted his head, feeling the attention on him. Jake knelt down beside him. "Ready to make some friends, buddy," he whispered. The dog wagged his tail just once, then trotted forward. The children squealed softly, kneeling down as Rex sniffed at their mittens. The littlest one, a girl named Maya, maybe 6 years old, her face nearly lost under a giant pink hat, offered a cookie with both of her small hands. "This is for you, puppy," she breathed. Rex took it with a gentle mouth. Then his eyes flickered up to Jake, a silent question asking if he'd been a good boy. Jake gave a slow nod. "Good boy." A ripple of children's laughter followed. "See, he gets it," Tommy exclaimed. "Told you so." For a few brief moments, the hallway was alive with the sound of laughter and the soft scuff of little boots on the floor. Leaning against the doorframe, Jake watched in silence. The sound wasn't jarring. It was a balm, a reminder of the gentle hum of life, a background warmth he'd thought was lost forever. After the children had gone, Jake stepped back into the quiet of his home, closing the door with a quiet click. On the counter lay his small whittling knife and a rough piece of pine wood salvaged from an old crate. A quiet purpose settled over him. By dusk, a small hand-carved sign was hanging next to his front door. The words were carved with care, every letter a silent plea. Asterisk, speak softly. He listens to kindness. He stepped back, a sense of rightness settling in him. He looked down at Rex, who sat watching, his head tilted curiously. "That's our new rule," Jake murmured. "No more shouting. No more harm." The dog's tail gave a single slow wag, a solemn promise. Later that night, as city lights danced on the surface of Sloan's Lake, Jake led Rex out for a brief walk. The air still held the sharp bite of winter, but the streets were breathing with life. The scrape of a neighbor's shovel, a couple walking hand in hand, the warm glow from restaurant windows spilling onto the cold sidewalks. For the first time in a long time, Jake saw how alive Denver was once you stopped counting the ghosts at your shoulder. They came to a corner where a small diner's sign flickered against the dark. A little bell chimed as he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The diner was almost deserted. Behind the counter stood Sam Doyle, the owner, a man in his late 40s with a solid, barrel-chested build and a thick mustache that seemed to have a life of its own. Gray was just starting to claim his temples, and he moved with the steady, deliberate grace of a man who had made peace with his own pain long ago. He looked up, a knowing smile touching his lips. "Evening, stranger. Don't believe I've seen you around." His voice held the slightest trace of a southern drawl. "Just moved to the neighborhood," Jake said, pulling off his gloves. "Coffee to go, please." Sam just nodded, turning to fill a cup from the pot. "That's a fine-looking dog," he commented, his gaze falling to Rex, sitting quietly by Jake's leg. "You military?" Jake paused for a fraction of a second. "Was." Sam slid the steaming cup across the counter. "Figured as much. I know the stance. Army myself," he added, "till a back injury taught me I wasn't invincible. Now I just serve up caffeine instead of orders." He chuckled softly. "You'll find half the vets in this neighborhood one way or another. Denver's quiet enough to let you heal, but loud enough to remind you that you're still alive." A faint smile touched Jake's lips. "I can drink to that." He paid for the coffee, took the cup, and stepped back out into the biting cold. Sam's words echoed in his head on the walk home. Asterisk, quiet enough for healing, loud enough to remember. Maybe that was it? Not peace, not yet, but balance. As they were crossing the street, Rex froze in his tracks, his nose twitching at the distant sound of church bells. He lifted his head and let out a single clear bark, strong, confident, and free of fear. Jake looked down at his companion, feeling something deep inside him shift. "You're finding your voice again faster than I am, pal," he said softly. Back at their apartment, the new sign by the door caught the warm light from the hall. Jake gently brushed a speck of dust from its edge and whispered, "Yeah, it fits." Rex circled twice, then collapsed by the heater with a soft sigh. Jake sank deep into the couch, the coffee's heat warming his hands. The ghost of the children's laughter still echoed in his ears, the sound of life pressing against the walls he'd built around his heart. Denver was changing not through some grand event, but in the smallest moments: a quiet bark, a simple cookie, a neighbor's kindness. And in those small graces, he realized that just surviving was slowly, quietly becoming living again. The afternoon bled out under a pale winter sun that offered no real warmth to the bones of Denver. The streets shone with a thin film of half-melted snow, the air biting and sharp like metal, carrying the distant drone of traffic and the lonely occasional bark of a restless dog. Jake Miller was wrestling with the broken latch on his small wooden gate when his phone buzzed sharply in his pocket. A notification from the neighborhood group lit up his screen. "Lost dog alert. A corgi named Bean, last seen near City Park, possibly by the frozen pond. Small, tan, and white, wearing a blue scarf." A frown creased Jake's face as he glanced instinctively at Rex, who lay soaking in a patch of weak sunlight by the door. The shepherd immediately lifted his head, sensing the shift in his owner's breath before a word was spoken. "Come on, pal," Jake murmured. "Time to earn that sign on our fence." City Park was hauntingly empty when they arrived. The sky had already started to bruise with twilight, casting long, dramatic strokes of blue and gray across the snow. Rex moved ahead, nose to the ground, his stride confident yet wary. The dog had filled out in recent weeks, his shoulders stronger, his gait certain, but his eyes still held that flicker of old wariness around strangers. Jake followed him along the icy, cracking footpath, the sharp crunch of his boots the only sound in the stillness. Near the entrance, a woman stood huddled in a heavy wool coat, scanning the distance anxiously. Linda Carmichael in her early 40s. Strands of auburn hair escaped her knit cap, her cheeks red from cold and worry. Her whole posture screamed exhaustion born of both terror and guilt. In one gloved hand, she gripped a small blue leash. As she saw Jake, a flicker of fragile hope lit up her face. You're from the apartments on Sloane's Hill, aren't you? She asked, her voice shaking. The one with the shepherd. Everyone's talking about him. Jake just nodded. This is Rex, he said, gesturing. We heard about Bean. When was the last time you saw him? About an hour ago, she managed, her voice cracking. He just bolted, chased a snowplow. He's never been gone this long. My son, he's a wreck. She dropped to one knee, pulling a small piece of cloth from her pocket. It was the corner of the corgi's blue scarf, torn and damp. Jake knelt down beside her, offering the fabric for Rex to scent. The shepherd's nostrils flared as he took in the scent. He exhaled once, sharp, his gaze locking onto the dark tree line past the park. His entire body went rigid with focus. You got it, Jake murmured. He'll lead. Linda nodded, trailing a few steps behind as they plunged deeper into the park. Near the pond, the snow grew deeper, the wind cutting with a sharper edge. Ancient pines loomed over them on both sides, their shadows stretching long and ghost-like in the failing light. Rex wove with purpose between the trunks, his nose deciphering an invisible map on the frozen earth. Jake's boots broke the crust with each step, the cold air seeping through his gloves. Out on the horizon, a thin, high-pitched whine pierced the howling wind. Rex went rigid, ears sharp, his tail a straight, unwavering line. Then, he was gone, a dark blur streaking toward the cry. Rex! Jake yelled, his own feet churning through the deep snow. They found the pond's edge a frozen sheet bordered by a broken-down fence, and there, nearly swallowed by a snowdrift trembling uncontrollably, was a little corgi, hopelessly snarled, in a rusted coil of wire. His scarf was snagged tight on the jagged splinters of the fence, pinning him perilously close to the treacherous, thin ice. Easy now, Jake murmured, his voice a steady, practiced calm, his training taking over every instinct, falling into familiar crisis mode. He moved in low, slow, so as not to spook the terrified creature. The corgi whimpered, frozen in place, its paws clawing weakly at the snow. Rex stood sentinel nearby, head erect, body taut, his gaze locked on the smaller dog. Jake knelt meticulously, working the wire free. The frigid metal bit at his fingers like fire, but he never hesitated. It's okay, Bean, he whispered a promise in the frozen air. We got you. The small dog's chest rose and fell in ragged, shallow breaths. As the last strand of wire fell away, Jake gathered the dog into his arms. Bean felt impossibly light, his fur drenched and cold, his little body vibrating like a hummingbird's wings. Rex fell into position at Jake's flank without a command, a loyal shadow. His ears swiveled, tracking every groan of the ice under their boots. They forged a path back across the park, a two-man, one-dog rescue team. Their footprints marked a winding trail of salvation. Linda was by the bench, her gloved hands covering her mouth, her breath misting in the air. Then she saw the small bundle in Jake's arms, and a strangled cry, half relief and half sob, escaped her. Oh, thank God, she wept, stumbling forward. Jake gently transferred Bean into her embrace. The corgi managed a faint lick on her chin before burrowing into her coat. He needs to get warm, Jake advised. Get him inside now. I can give you a ride. Linda shook her head, tears instantly crystallizing on her eyelashes in the cold. Our building is right across from the museum. I'll make it. Her gaze fell upon Rex, who watched stoically, snowflakes clinging to his muzzle. Thank you, you beautiful hero, she whispered. Rex gave a single, solemn blink, then a soft, affirming bark that brought a watery laugh from her. By the time they returned to the apartment, the news had already made its rounds. Mrs. Baker was framed in her window, waving with pure joy. The neighborhood group chat was buzzing with alerts. The German Shepherd found Bean, a real-life search and rescue mission. The kids from the floor below spilled into the courtyard, chanting Rex's name, as if he were a returning champion. Tommy proudly held a cardboard sign, the letters scrawled in marker, Rex the Hero Dog. Jake tried to gently deflect the praise, the sudden spotlight making his skin crawl. But their joy was infectious. Even Rex seemed to feel the change in the air. His tail held high, his ears tuned to confidence, not the familiar frequency of caution. Jake dropped to one knee beside him, burying a hand in his thick ruff. "Good work, soldier," he said quietly. "Real good work." The shepherd leaned his heavy head against Jake's shoulder. That evening, Linda appeared at their door with Bean, who was now fluffy and dry, trotting with pride in a brand-new blue sweater. She offered Jake a basket with hot cocoa mix and a handwritten card. "This is from my son and me," she explained, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for reminding us that not all heroes wear a uniform." She glanced down at Rex with shining eyes. "Some of them just wear fur." Jake took the basket, a genuine, unguarded smile touching his lips. "We'll just add this to the after-action report." Linda laughed, a bright, clear sound. After she left, the hallway was filled with the faint scent of peppermint and overwhelming gratitude. Later, the snow began its silent descent once more. Jake was still on the sofa, Rex's heavy head a comforting weight across his knee. The television murmured in the background, a ghost of a sound, but their attention was miles away. On the shelf, the brown leather collar lay waiting right next to the small compass charm. Jake reached for it, turning the worn leather slowly in his hands. "You earned this, buddy," he whispered. Rex lifted his head, his gaze steady and calm. His tail gave a single knowing sweep against the floor. Jake carefully fastened the collar around his neck. The leather settled as if it had always been there. The small metal charm made a soft clink like a distant bell. "There," Jake said, his voice quiet. "It's official now." Rex let out a long breath, a deep, contented sound, before resting his head back down. Outside, the city was hushed beneath a gentle blanket of falling snow. In the window's reflection, Jake saw two silhouettes sitting close, a man and his dog etched against the darkening world, both bearing the scars of survival, both finally belonging. The small cafe on Colfax Avenue was filled with the scent of roasted coffee and warm cinnamon, a warm haven from the pale, swirling snow drifting past the glass. Jake Miller sat near the window, a silent observer. His old field jacket, a relic from another life, was draped over the chair next to him as steam rose from his chipped ceramic mug. The fading afternoon light stretched thin across the street, catching on the traffic signals, their red glow bleeding to amber on the slush-covered pavement. Denver in the winter held a quiet hum, a city of people moving just fast enough to keep the cold at bay, but slow enough for a man to think. Jake had come to prefer this pace. It reminded him that life didn't always have to be a fight to be lived. Rex was curled beneath the table, his head resting on Jake's boot eyes, half-lidded, his ears twitching at the chime of the front door. The shepherd had grown into his powerful frame, his coat now thick and his chest broad, a world away from the trembling pup, lost in the storm. He had earned the profound calm that now settled over him. Across the small table from Jake sat Sarah Collins, the veterinarian who had become his first real anchor in this new chapter of his life. She was tall and lean, with blonde hair tied back at the nape of her neck. Her fair skin was dusted with freckles, a map of years spent working under the high mountain sun. On this day, her familiar clinic scrubs were gone, replaced by a simple gray turtleneck and a soft wool coat. But her posture still held the quiet authority of someone who spends her days keeping small heartbeats steady. A kindness lived in her face, not fragile but weathered and strong, the kind that stares exhaustion in the eye and still chooses to show up the next morning. She was stirring her coffee absently, watching the slow, even rise and fall of Rex's breathing beneath the table. "He's come so far," she said, her voice soft. Jake gave a slow nod. So have I. He turned a small leather notebook over in his hands, its edges worn smooth from months of use. He was writing again. Not mission reports, not field orders, just thoughts. On one of the final pages in a neat, careful script, he had written, "No one really rescues anyone. We just learn how to stay." He tapped his pen gently against the page, and when he looked up, he saw Sarah offering a faint, knowing smile. "That's a good line," she said. "Could be a sermon," he replied with a slight chuckle. "Or a warning. Maybe it's both." She reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a small camera, an old analog Leica, the kind whose shutter clicked with a gentle sound that felt like memory being made. "May I?" she asked. Jake just shrugged, gesturing toward Rex. "He's the photogenic one." Sarah leaned in, focusing the lens just as Rex shifted in his sleep, his muzzle now resting on Jake's faded tactical gloves, a single paw draped protectively across them. The shot was perfect. A portrait of loyalty finding its rest, a history finding its peace. The shutter whispered closed. Sarah looked at the captured moment, and for an instant she couldn't breathe. "That's it," she breathed. "That's the entire story, isn't it?" Jake's gaze followed hers to the sleeping dog, and he replied quietly. "Yeah," he said. "That's home." They settled into a comfortable silence, watching the world outside being painted by the soft snowfall. Sarah eventually gathered her things deliberately, placing a folded napkin beside his cup. "You've done so well, Jake," she said, as she stood to leave. "And he's proof that healing doesn't always bark. Sometimes it just breathes." She offered a smile, the kind that lingered in the room long after she'd gone. When she left, Jake unfolded the napkin. Inside, her neat handwriting read, "What you saved in him, you also saved in yourself." By the time he stepped out of the cafe, the city had already dimmed into twilight. Street lamps began to flicker on their halos, glowing softly through the descending snow. Jake zipped his coat, stepping out onto K-Fax, with Rex padding alongside him, his confidence a steady, quiet presence. The world around them was bathed in a glow of blue and silver, the kind of stark beauty only winter dares to create. They walked home without any hurry, their boots crunching a steady rhythm on the fresh snow. Each of his exhales plumed into a small cloud that vanished into the frigid air. Back at the apartment, the windows were fogged with warmth. The low hum of the heater was a welcome embrace. Below Mrs. Baker's light glowed through the floorboards a faint and steady heartbeat. The wooden sign Jake had carved months before still hung beside the door. "Speak softly. He listens to kindness." Tonight, those words felt less like a warning and more like a benediction. Jake poured a mug of cocoa from the basket Linda Carmichael had left after the rescue. Its sweetness was a surprise, a flavor he'd never cared for before. The war had taught him to crave bitterness, but maybe sweetness was its own kind of courage. Rex settled by the hearth, his eyes glinting in the firelight, the brown collar and its small compass charm gleaming faintly. Jake just watched him for a long moment, then opened the window a crack. The air that rushed in was sharp, carrying snowflakes and the scent of pine. It was a crisp, clean cold, and it filled the small room like a confession that had finally been spoken aloud. He stepped onto the small balcony that overlooked the sleeping city. A light wind carried the muffled sounds of traffic and far-off laughter. Snowflakes descended in lazy spirals, each one catching the yellow glow of the streetlights, looking like 1,000 drifting embers. It reminded him of salt in the ocean during night dives, bright particles against the dark, scattered yet somehow luminous. He glanced down to find Rex had followed him. The dog sat beside him, his head tilted up, his dark eyes tracing the paths of the falling snow. A small smile touched Jake's lips as he rested a hand on the shepherd's neck, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath the thick fur. "Ready?" he said, his voice barely a whisper. Rex blinked slowly as if in reply. Jake reached then for the dog's collar, tightening the buckle just a bit until it rested firmly against the heavy fur. The charm clicked a quiet sound, like a compass needle finding true north. "There," he murmured. "You've earned your place, Sergeant Rex." The dog's tail gave a single, deliberate wag. Then he looked out over the city and without any warning let out 3 sharp barks. The sound echoed down the quiet street, crisp and clear, rolling through the Denver night like a signal flare. Not a warning, not a challenge, but a declaration. Jake let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah," he whispered. "Message received." He leaned back against the cold railing. He watched the city lights pulse a silent heartbeat, keeping time with the falling snow. Children's laughter, a faint echo mingled with a train's mournful cry. The world had found its voice again, and so had he. Inside, Jake returned to his notebook, turning to the last page. He wrote with a slow, deliberate hand, as if every word held its own warmth. Love, he wrote, is a gentle discipline. Maturity is finding a reason to smile even as the snow falls. Healing is walking together through the ghost sounds of war until all that's left is a heart whispering home. He put the pen aside, his gaze falling on Rex, who had surrendered once more to sleep. The dog's breathing was a steady tide filling the room. Jake took one last sip of cocoa, letting the warmth spread through him, and whispered into the stillness, "We made it home, buddy." Outside, the snow fell on, softly, endless, forgiving. The wind carried it over the entire city, across rooftops and alleys, over strangers and lonely lights, binding everything and everyone in a single silent hush. On Kfax Avenue, beneath the amber glow of the streetlights, the sound of 3 barks lingered like an answered prayer. And in the end, maybe the quiet miracle wasn't that a soldier found a dog, or that a broken man learned how to smile. It was knowing that grace walks among us disguised as loyalty, patience, and the small acts of love that change a life. Maybe God doesn't always announce his presence with thunder. Sometimes his voice is a whisper, a steady heartbeat beneath your hand, a bark echoing through the cold, snowy night, reminding us that we are never truly lost. If this story found a place in your heart, please share it and leave a comment, subscribe, and let others feel that same warmth. May you and your home be blessed, and every living soul that reminds you that love is the most ordinary, and therefore the most divine miracle of all.